Well, India recently amended its citizenship law. Burma has had these laws on the books for a long time. For Americans who may not be familiar with these types of laws, what are citizenship laws?
So these are laws that basically lay out what someone needs to do to demonstrate that they're a citizen, or to become a citizen, and if they've actually come into the country within a certain period of time. And so both in Burma and in India, there have been laws that have been on the books for a very long time. And what's happening now is that in some ways they're being used to question the citizenship of people who may have lived in or have been citizens of a country for a very long time, but they're being used to actually target particular communities and to question their citizenship.
So what communities are being targeted by under the guise of these laws?
So for now, the citizenship laws are really targeting Muslim communities, both in Burma with the Rohingya Muslims, and then in India now, where there are 200 million Muslims in India, 14% of the population. And what we've seen is that the targeting of Muslims started in the state of Assam, which is in the northeast part of the country, and there are a lot of concerns that it's going to spread throughout the country as part of a renewed sense of India being a Hindu nation in a number of different ways.
And when you say targeted, what do you mean by that? What is the reality on the ground?
Sure, so there's two things happening. One is that in December, the Indian Parliament passed a law called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And what that does is basically say, for people who are coming from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, if they are of any religion other than being Muslim, they have a pathway to citizenship. But if you're Muslim, you don't have that pathway. Now that on its own might not be something that would be of serious concern, but it's coupled with a different process, which is that starting in the state of Assam in the northeast, but now maybe going around the country, there's an effort to try and create a national register of citizens. And what that is that people have to come forward and show documentation that they were citizens as of many decades ago, or that their ancestors were. And the problem with that is that a lot of people don't have that kind of paperwork. And you're in a country of a lot of people who are very poor. There's not a lot of good record keeping. And so what we saw in Assam already, which is just one state, is that when they first started this process, 16 million people weren't able to sort of meet that bar. And then they had a couple of different processes to try and allow people to demonstrate their citizenship. But at the end of that process, there were still 2 million people who weren't able to show that citizenship documentation according to the process they laid out. And so the concern is that if that kind of process is brought to communities around India, that coupled with the fact that there's no real pathway back to citizenship for Muslims is something that is an effort to really take away the rights of citizenship and citizenship itself for many millions of people across the country.
Does this go against international norms?
It does. In many different ways. One, it obviously violates the article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, that we at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom are most focused on, which is Article 18. And that article says that you should have the ability to practice your religion or not to, or to believe or not to believe, and that's something that should be protected. It also violates other provisions of international human rights standards that say that people should have a nationality. They should be able to be a citizen of a country. And what we're seeing with the Rohingya, for example, is that once Burma decided that people who had lived there for generations were not going to be able to be considered as citizens, and they have pushed them out into Bangladesh, and they are sitting there, right, not really having a sense that they are citizens of any country. And so the pathway back to a life where they can work, where they can move, where their children can be educated, is something that has been cut off for them from this fact that they don't actually have the rights of citizenship in any country at the moment. And so they really want to make their citizenship current in Burma. That is the goal for many of the Rohingya, and to make sure that they continue to not be described. This is not how they want to be described, but many describe them as being stateless at this moment.
You mentioned the plight that Muslims are facing in both countries. What about, and you said that Christians were part of the groups that have a path to citizenship in India under this amended law. What about Burma? How are Christians faring?
So I think both in Burma and India, there's a concern that some of the provisions that we're seeing now, so the National Register of Citizens, or who actually gets to be a citizen in a citizenship documentation process, that Christians or people of other faiths that are not the predominant faith in either one of these countries, in Burma being Buddhist and in India being Hindu, that they may face similar challenges to their citizenship. And we're seeing that, at least within India, that Christian communities are being targeted in many ways as for concerns about whether or not they're converting people within India. Same kind of concerns are being raised in Burma, and if they are, they're subject to some of the violence and the sort of targeting that we're seeing for Muslim communities as well. And so there's a lot of concern that as these countries move into a situation where they're essentially saying we want these countries to either be Hindu or Buddhist, that everyone is open to attacks not only on their citizenship but on their livelihood, on their ability to worship too.
Yeah, I guess on the ground sometimes these situations can turn into us versus them, right? When you have the law on your side and when you don't. In communities, are you seeing that where communities where different faiths have worked together, lived together for generations, that now there's added tension because of these laws?
Absolutely. So part of what we're seeing in India is the worst communal violence that we have seen in decades. India is a place where people of all faiths have lived together in harmony for many, many years, right? For hundreds of years. And in some ways, that's why this moment is of such concern to people, is because the citizenship laws and this effort to try and have people document whether or not they actually are part of communities that they have been part of for so long is something that is giving license to people to feel like they can target or direct violence to these communities. And so part of what we've seen even in the last week in Delhi is there have been silent and they've been peaceful protests against these citizenship laws since December, and then there's been violence around those protests, and unfortunately that violence has led to what we saw last week, which was literally mobs of people running through parts of Delhi. Both Muslims and Hindus have died in attacks where people are being asked on their street whether or not they're Muslim, and if they are, they've been beaten. And unfortunately, in numbers that are too high to even contemplate, there were more than 40 people who died last week in that violence, and 200 who were injured. And people are fleeing their homes because they're being burned to the ground. And we've also seen attacks on mosques in Delhi that are coming out of that kind of violence. And so part of what the concern here is that while part of the effort has been to talk about citizenship, it is part of a larger sense that people don't belong here. They're not part of the country. And that because of that, they can be subject to violence or to being pushed out in ways that should never be the case for people who have really lived in harmony for so many years. One bright note and positive note is that we are seeing that people of all faiths are reaching out and have offered protection, have offered a way in which people who are fleeing this violence can find safety. And so it's pretty extraordinary to see the ways in which, for example, the Sikh Gurdwaras in India, churches have been places of sanctuary for those who are fleeing some of this violence.
That's wonderful. Well, while all this has been going on, President Trump visited India recently. Is there any indication that U.S. concerns about this were raised during that visit?
So unfortunately, I think that during that visit, there were not, at least the president didn't raise these concerns with Prime Minister Modi, and made a statement as he was leaving that as he was leaving, there was literally violence going on a few miles away, the violence I was just describing. And as he was leaving, he said that the religious freedom conditions are incredible in India. And I think that's not certainly what we at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom or what the State Department has put out in terms of what's happening in India right now. And it's certainly not what we're seeing on the ground in terms of widespread international concern, including from the United Nations and many other bodies about what's happening in India.
And remind folks listening to this why America cares so greatly about promoting religious freedom in every nation.
It really is a matter of a human right that people have to be able to practice their faith in the way in which they choose. And that's something that we hold dear here in the United States, and I think want to make sure that people around the world don't face the kind of violence and persecution that we've known has been part of our global history in so many ways for decades. And so if there are ways in which we can help to promote religious freedom, that is something that we have tried to do in countries around the world that are in transition, where we know that being able to welcome and to promote inclusion for everyone is something that brings safety, it brings stability, and it brings a more prosperous nations for everyone. And so at a time where we're seeing refugee populations at the highest that we've seen in many decades, it's something that is incredibly important, because many of the reasons why we're seeing communities flee and face persecution is related to their religion.
Commissioner Bhargava, thank you so much.